River Ebro, Spain, 1938. The anti-aircraft guns blast away at the planes overhead, yet seem to do little good. You're driving a truck filled with vital ammunition, but the only way you can cross the swirling River Ebro to get to the other bank is the pontoon bridge up ahead, a perfect bottleneck for the planes to attack. As if to confirm your fears, a fighter swoops down and rakes the bridge with its machine guns. A soldier abandons his vehicle and runs for it, but the bullets smash into his body, and he falls into the river below. As a now burning car is pushed out of the way, they wave you onto the bridge. Driving across, your knuckles are white on the steering wheel, begging the vehicles up ahead to speed up. Then you hear it, the inhuman scream of a Stuka dive bomber. As it swoops down towards you, it is all too much to take. Abandoning your truck, you dive into the water just in time as its bombs smash into the bridge and it disappears in a huge explosion, men and vehicles thrown up into the air. I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
Damals uns ausgebeten. Wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen.
Hello everyone, welcome to the show. It's taken me 7 episodes, our longest series to date, but we have finally reached the end of the Spanish Civil War. After the disaster that was Teruel, the Republican zone had been cut in two. Defeat seemed merely a matter of time, as the storm clouds of war gathered over Europe and the Munich Crisis began. The Republican leaders made one last great gamble for survival. Everything the faltering Republic had left was gathered for a make-or-break offensive. While the longest and bloodiest battles of the Civil War was at hand, at stake, the very soul of Spain itself. By April 1938, morale was at rock bottom among the civilian population of the Republican zone. Hyperinflation raged unchecked, with the cost of living having tripled in less than 2 years of war. Even if you could afford it, there was little to actually buy. Food was in short supply, with the people living on a diet of chickpeas and lentils. The Nationalists had captured the vital hydroelectric plants in the Pyrenees that powered Catalonian industry. Now those factories stood idle, along with their workers. Those who grumbled too much or criticised their dear leaders disappeared into the prisons of the SIM, the Republic's communist-controlled secret police. The situation in Barcelona was particularly dire. It was now the capital of the Republic, supposedly for security reasons, but actually to secure communist control over this once anarchist-dominated city. It gained little from this so-called privilege. Flooded with refugees fleeing from Aragon, food supplies were at breaking point. The food queues were so long that women were killed and maimed during bombing raids because they would not give up their places. Already bruised and battered, Barcelona then suffered one of the worst air raids of the whole war. Mussolini was fed up that his Italian expeditionary force hadn't fought a major engagement since Santander back in 1937. In a fit of pique, from the 16th of March to the 18th, 1938, the city was pounded every 3 hours non-stop. The Italians treated it as an experiment, trying out different combinations of high explosives, incendiaries and anti-personnel bombs. Soon the city centre was almost deserted, the streets filled with broken glass and rubble. The worst attack occurred on March the 17th. A lorry carrying high explosives, which happened to be passing the Colosseum Cinema on the Gran Via, was hit. The blast destroyed almost an entire street. Soon, false rumours spread that Mussolini was using gigantic experimental bombs. British nurse Anne Murray revealed just how cruel this bombing campaign was. Quote, "We found a whole lot of children, dozens of them, with their hands off, completely off. The Italians had dropped anti-personnel bombs marked chocolate. The children were picking up these things. They hadn't had chocolate for years, and they just blew their hands off. This Spanish surgeon I worked with, he was in tears. We all were." End quote. After killing 1,300 people and wounding thousands more, the Duce was overjoyed. He boasted to his foreign minister and son-in-law that, quote, "The Italians have managed to provoke horror by their aggression instead of complacency with their mandolins. This will send up our stock in Germany, where they love total and ruthless war." End quote. As the people of Barcelona suffered, they couldn't help but notice their leaders were living the high life. Just like in Orwell's Animal Farm, everyone was equal, but some were more equal than others. Republican Prime Minister and Communist ally Juan Negrin smoked expensive Havana cigars and gorged himself silly. Some evenings he would eat one dinner at home, another at a restaurant, and a third at a nightclub. He had a huge appetite for women as well, openly boasting to one colleague that he was, quote, "an animal, and needed his hands free for his desires. Every 10 days, a new woman." End quote. I have to admire his stamina. High-up communist officials joined in the fun, indulging in expensive champagne and cocaine, while feasting on foods that were now luxuries for their people. In a particularly tone-deaf moment, the communists threw a people's banquet for Negrin. A black-tie event for only the most influential officials, they gorged themselves on champagne, caviar and lobster. Needless to say, this didn't go down well with the starving masses, who angrily protested outside. "It's all for the benefit of the people, comrades." It wasn't all banquets and good times for the Republican leadership. They were also squabbling among themselves again. Moderates such as President Azana and Defense Minister Prieto were finally turning against the communists. They had supported their takeover back in May 1937, believing that only centralization and discipline could win the war. Now, after Brunete, Belchite, and especially Teruel, they were disillusioned and increasingly defeatist. Prieto even told the startled French ambassador that the Republic was doomed. They belatedly tried to weaken communist control over the army, and especially the SIM. But it was all too little, too late. Prieto was outmaneuvered and forced to resign, while Zana lapsed back into defeatist apathy. Their brief revolt had actually ended up increasing communist power in the Republic. It wasn't all bad news. There were a few chinks of light in the darkening clouds over the Republic. In the rest of Europe, events were moving towards the outbreak of World War II, as Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland and took over Austria in the Nationalists. If the Republic could hold on until another European war broke out, they would finally get the assistance the democracies had denied them for almost 2 years. As a nice little bonus, France briefly opened up its border and arms flowed in. The identity of one of the biggest suppliers of arms to the Republic would have really shocked Franco. It was the one, the only, Hermann Göring. That's right, the Deputy Führer, head of the Luftwaffe and ruler of the German economy. He was playing both sides. While he pestered Franco for more mineral concessions, he sold arms to the Republic in exchange for gold and silver. He did show a modicum of loyalty to Franco, sometimes sending the Republic boxes filled with bricks rather than the guns they had purchased. The second ray of light was that Franco didn't follow up his great success in dividing the Republican zone by then finishing off Catalonia. Italy, Germany, and his own generals begged him to, but the caudillo wouldn't be moved. He had heard false rumours that France would enter the war if he took Barcelona, so instead he turned his forces south towards Valencia. In reality, the French government and High Command were already racked by defeatism and were focused on Germany. There was no chance of this happening. But the moment slipped away, and the Republic was given precious time to rebuild. Meanwhile, the Valencia offensive was a disaster. The Republicans have finally learned some lessons from their previous battles. The defensive fortifications, called the XYZ line, were filled with well-built trenches and bunkers. They'd also learned to plan their fields of fire better to prevent infiltration of their positions via deck ground, while their artillery batteries prepared fire plans to bombard the most likely staging areas for Nationalist attacks. Under the blazing sun, the Nationalists launched attack after attack. Not even with 1,000 field guns and air attacks could they break the front. As the offensive stuttered to a bloody halt, Franco's men had suffered 20,000 casualties, compared to only 5,000 for the Republicans. It was an even greater success than the more famous Battle of Guadalajara. It really showed how different the war could have been with a defensive strategy. But it wasn't to be. Soon an all too familiar chorus began to be echoed by Negrin and the Communists. Let's launch another massive offensive. After all, it worked before, didn't it? Some people just never learn. The Battle of the Ebro occupies a special place in the Spanish Civil War. Historians and all who study this period are often fascinated by its dark glamour. Conceived in desperation, it was an apocalyptic struggle over 5 terrible months. Soldiers were pushed to breaking point, asked to endure the unendurable, kept going only through hate, fear, and images of everlasting victory or eternal defeat. A terrible fever had gripped Spain since the creation of the Second Republic, soaring ever higher under the radicalizing effects of war, and Ebro would be its peak. There would still be much hardship and death to come after, but this round of the eternal battle between the two Spains would finally be decided. The offensive's official aims were to reunite the Republican zone at best, at worst, to divert nationalist pressure from Valencia. Yet everyone involved, from lowly grunt to communist commissar, knew that actually this was a massive gamble on the international scene. In mid-1938, Hitler was stepping up his campaign against Czechoslovakia, and fears of war stalked the continent. Negrin and his communist allies believed that a European war would break out in 1938 and save their regime. They just needed time and to prove that the Republic was still viable as an ally for France and Britain. The aim of the upcoming offensive was simply to capture as much territory as possible, then dig in and defend it at all costs. The Republican army was essentially a crazy man pulling down his trousers, baring his big hairy buttocks at Franco with a red target on them, yelling, "Come and get me if you think you're hard enough." Offended at losing territory and lured by the juicy target of the last large Republican army, Franco would turn away from other fronts and fight a grinding battle of attrition. Republican losses would be horrific, but so would the Nationalists. The army just needed to hold on until the greater European war came. As one American survivor later recalled, quote, "The men knew there was little chance for a total defeat of the enemy. They fought specifically in terms of seizing territory, entrenching, and then holding it to the last man." End quote. It was heroic, but completely mad. It also had a fatal flaw. What if World War II didn't start in 1938? Franco had the greater resources. He would win a battle of attrition, and then the Republic would have nothing left. The People's Army would be broken. This was the epic gamble Negrin and the Communists were about to take. To find the manpower for their newly created Army of the Ebro, they truly had to scrape the barrel. The new conscripts ranged from 16-year-olds, which veterans called the Quinta de Biberon, the baby's bottle call-up, to middle-aged fathers. Mixed with these were nationalist prisoners of war, kidnapped foreign workers, and even some patients from an insane asylum. Thanks to such measures, they had an army of 80,000 troops. Their most had barely had any training. They were given the last reserves of tanks and aircraft, but this wasn't much. Its biggest weakness was a lack of artillery, most of which had been captured during Franco's drive to the sea. The whole army had no more than 150 field guns, some of which dated from the last century. As the icing on the cake, their 76mm anti-aircraft ammunition was known to be defective, although the soldiers were not informed about this on the orders of the communists. Quote, "for reasons of morale," end quote. As well as being poorly trained and poorly equipped, the army of the Ebro would repeat all the old mistakes of Brunete, Belchite, and Teruel, just on steroids. Strong points are not going to be bypassed, instead they will stop to capture them and lose all momentum. These men will also be fighting in the baking heat, while their supply lines will repeatedly fail. Ammunition and water will become rarities. While the scene had been set for a disaster, the prep for the first phase of the offensive was surprisingly good. The crossing of the river Ebro was prepared in minute detail for weeks beforehand, with the Republican troops practicing in ravines, rivers, and on the coast. The Engineer Corps mocked up the crossing with bridges built in Barcelona or bought in France. Meanwhile, commandos slipped across the river at night. They made contact with peasants on the other side to obtain information on nationalist positions. As well as training, the ordinary soldiers spent their time assembling boats and pontoon bridges, and in many cases, actually learning to swim. This didn't go unnoticed by the nationalist defenders. They weren't blind or deaf, and they certainly weren't idiots. They sent increasingly frantic warnings up the chain of command, but Franco and his advisers dismissed them, claiming it was unthinkable that the Red Army, which had been so severely mauled in Aragon, would be ready to undertake any sort of offensive, especially one across a broad river. On a moonless night on the 25th of July 1938, so chosen to conceal the preparations, 80,000 men massed on the muddy banks of a 20-mile bend in the fast-flowing river. Among them were all 5 international brigades, some of who softly sang revolutionary songs in the darkness to keep up their spirits. Commandos went across silently and knifed the sentries on the far bank, and then fastened lines for the assault boats to follow. 6 Republican divisions then began to cross the Ebro, with the lead units in assault boats, guided by local peasants who knew the river. French units of the international brigades were given the task of crossing the river further downstream, near its delta. They were to act as a diversion to draw off nationalist troops from where the main crossing would take place. Most never made it to the other side of the river. 1,200 men were shot or drowned in just 24 hours. A young French Algerian, René Cazadia, led the only group to make it across. They found themselves trapped with a canal in front, the river behind, and Francoists firing on them from above. Cazadia and his men shouted back for help, but none could come because of the intensity of enemy fire. At dawn, a few men finally reached the unit's position, but found that they were all dead, except for a wounded René, who, realizing that he himself was dying, took out his pistol and shot himself in the head. For the rest of the army, the river crossing went much better. Harry C. Shepard, Jr., a member of the Washington Lincoln Brigades, recalled, quote, "The whole maneuver went off like clockwork. Each man was trained for a particular job. It was an immensely good piece of work on the part of the authorities to coordinate all the movement, altogether about the most brilliant thing the Loyalist army has done in the whole war," end quote. As those in the boats seized control of the opposite banks, the bulk of the forces followed using 12 different pontoon bridges set up by the engineers. Progress was rapid. The Hungarian Rakusi battalion and a Polish unit crossed over near the small town of Asko and marched on. By 11 a.m. they had reached the Venta di Capucinas, 10 kilometers inland from the river, where they discovered a battalion of nationalists were sitting around preparing lunch. Taking them by surprise, they were captured and added to the Republican haul of 4,000 prisoners. By midday, they reached the town of Corbera de Ebro, where they linked up with the British battalion. They were greeted by shouts in Catalan of "Long live Catalonia! Long live the Republic!" By mid-afternoon, they were just outside the main target, the city of Gandesa. It was a key nationalist communication hub. If they could take it, it would severely disrupt their operations. In little more than 24 hours, General Modesto's troops had seized 800 square kilometers. It was an outstanding success. Here is where things began to go wrong, however. Gandesa was heavily fortified and had just been reinforced. Franco's top general, Yagüe, had sent the 13th Division on a 50-kilometer forced march in the blazing July sun to get there in time. Men died of heat exhaustion, while the feet of many others were in a pitiful, bloody mess. The American brigadier, Alva Bessie, boasted in his diary, quote, "practically no resistance," end quote. However, even he couldn't help adding a hint of foreboding, quote, "that will come later, when the fascists have gathered their material for a counterattack," end quote. He was correct. Franco unleashed the Condor Legion, backed by Italian and Spanish planes. 143 bombers and 100 fighters in total. They targeted the vulnerable pontoon bridges across the river. They ruled the skies and rained down death at will. The Republican planes were nowhere to be seen. Then the Nationalists unleashed their most lethal weapon of all. They opened the locks and dams on rivers feeding into the Ebro. A tidal wave of water swept away most of the remaining pontoon bridges, on which Modesto's troops relied for supply and reinforcements. Republican engineers managed to repair them within 2 days, but the timing had been disastrous. Only a small number of tanks and guns had crossed the river. Many had been caught in the flood and destroyed. Throughout the battle, the constant bombing of the bridges taxed the Republican engineers to the limit. Each night they repaired the damage done during the day, a process resembling the nightmarish scenes at the bridge at Do Long in Apocalypse Now. If you get that reference, kudos, you have great taste in movies. As the pontoon bridges took a pounding, the Republicans attacked Gandesa with their few remaining tanks. Spanish conscripts and the Canadian Mac Paps Brigade advanced and were met by a blizzard of nationalist fire. The defenders had heavily fortified the former Farmers' Cooperative headquarters and, of all things, the local cemetery, due to its high stone walls. Taking heavy casualties and being pounded from the air, the Republicans managed to break through the outer defences. One Mac-Pat patrol even managed to reach the town's stone marker, but around the cemetery, the advance faltered. Bullets smash into the stone walls of the cemetery, turning them into Swiss cheese. Your comrade, Juan, famous for his black humour, shouts to you, "At least if we die here, it will be easy to bury us." Rolling your eyes, you fire through a gap in the wall, hitting a charging Red who cartwheels into the dust, immediately taking cover as bullets rake your position in retaliation. Then you hear an all too familiar sound. Tank tracks. 3 lumbering metal monsters head towards the cemetery, while the Red infantry pour in fire from behind. One of your machine gun posts fires futilely at the tanks, its bullets harmlessly ricocheting off. Their turrets swing around, and 3 shells reduce the post's to rubble. As they continue their relentless advance, you back away from the stone wall, taking cover behind the rows of graves, hoping those new anti-tank guns are as good as the Germans claim. As a shell smashes into the cemetery wall, blowing a hole in it, the anti-tank guns roar in unison, and the 3 tanks are rapidly reduced to scrap metal before your very eyes. Praise God and the Virgin Mary. Praise Franco. The new anti-tank guns were the German 88mm, soon to be feared across Europe and North Africa. The Mac Paps in No. 2 Company became some of the first soldiers to see their lethal efficiency, watching in horror as 3 Republican tanks passed through their position and returned into blazing hulks, just like in the dramatization. As well as the 88mm guns, the Republican tanks were being massacred from the skies by the Condor Legion. It became an infantry battle, with enemy machine gun fire spitting death and destruction across a sun-scorched hellscape, leaving the Canadians and Spanish scrambling for the scraps of cover available. Despite multiple charges and 4 days of intense fighting, the defences of Gandesa held. Meanwhile, their colleagues in the British Brigade and Spanish reinforcements were fighting for the high ground outside the city. The appalling smell that wafted down revealed how well that was going, with the nearby hills littered with unburied corpses left bloated, rotting and animal-picked in the summer heat. The British Brigade's main target was Hill 481, nicknamed the Pimple by the Brits, that soared over Gandesa and was vital to its defence. It was heavily fortified, with bunkers, trenches, barbed wire and booby traps. Some of the slopes were almost sheer, providing powerful natural defences. It was early on the 27th of July 1938 when the British No. 1 Company launched an attack on Hill 481 and was beaten back by a hail of fire from guns. Grenades rolled down the hillside and artillery. Rocks splintered and men were mown down in a suicidal death trap. For 5 days, 3 companies of the 15th Brigade kept up their efforts to take the hill, but were often pinned down and trapped for hours by incessant fire. Casualties were high, and a number of commanders were killed or wounded. On the 1st of August, the final assault was made on the Pimple, amidst a pounding from artillery and a barrage of bullets. Some managed to get within 20 metres of the enemy positions, but could go no further. Trapped in their positions, the men suffered huge casualties, and it was clear the attempt had failed. One British volunteer, a young Labour councillor from Liverpool by the name of Jack Jones, later become the famous, or infamous, General Secretary of the Transport and General Workers Union, was running up the hill when his right arm went numb and blood flowed from his shoulder. Waiting for darkness to fall, he crawled back and was eventually taken to the field hospital at Morah de Ebro, which he recalled as, quote, "like an abattoir. There was blood and the smell of blood everywhere." End quote. With the offensive stalling, the Republican Air Force finally arrived on the scene. The largest air battles of the whole war now rise to the skies above the Ebro River. On the 31st of July alone, no less than 300 missions were flown with fighter aircraft, mixed in dogfights and attacking bombers to prevent them from dropping their loads on their comrades on the ground. They did their best, but they were soon being massacred by superior German pilots. Many even ended up being destroyed on the ground as the Condor Legion attacked their undefended air bases. In the face of Nationalist air and artillery superiority, and with his forces trapped with their backs to the river, Modesto ordered the Republican Army on the defensive, his political commissars echoing the slogan, "Resist, fortify, and be vigilant." They had lost 12,000 men to gain an area of desolate, scorched terrain of no strategic value. The heat increased relentlessly, reaching 37 degrees in the shade and 57 in the sun. Even the night brought little relief. It was impossible to dig trenches in the iron-hard earth and rocky landscape. They could only protect themselves with parapets and sangers made from stones. They soon found that artillery shells were far more lethal in such surroundings than in the open countryside, for each explosion turned stones into shrapnel. There was still time for the Republic to at least withdraw its best troops and salvage something from the wreckage, but they proceeded with their crazy plan. They were successful in at least one thing. Franco took the bait. He began drawing troops from all other fronts to fight at the Ebro. Complaints flowed in, both from his own generals and his Italian and German allies. They begged Franco to reconsider, saying that the Republicans could be contained and isolated while they advanced on Valencia, or the relatively undefended Barcelona. Back in Rome, Mussolini whined to his foreign secretary and son-in-law, Ciano, about Franco's, quote, flabby conduct of the war. I prophesy the defeat of Franco. Either the man doesn't know how to make war, or he doesn't want to. End quote. Oh, Mussolini, you'll soon find out you have no idea how to make war either. Franco refused to budge. He had already accepted that this was a war of attrition, that to take a city was useless if the Republican army remained intact. There was time for Barcelona, Valencia, and Madrid later. For now, who was he to look a gift horse in the mouth when the Republicans had offered up their last great army to be destroyed? As he said with a cold smile to his doubting officers, quote, I have the best of the Republican army shut up in an area of 35 kilometres. End quote. He took personal command of the Nationalist troops. This phase of the battle was while grinding attrition. The Republicans dug in, or at least tried to, in the mountain ranges of the Sierra de Pandores and the Sierra de Cavaz. They were just in front of Gandesa. Franco now tasked his troops to break through these mountain barriers, whatever the cost, and reclaim all of the lost territory. Ebro went from a war of movement to one of grinding attrition. From August to November 1938, the Nationalists launched 6 counterattacks in total, and I'm not going to cover each of them in depth, as it's literally World War I style throwing men into an endless meat grinder. I'm just going to give you the highlights of this phase of the battle and a taste of how it was for the men fighting. To dislodge the Republicans from their mountain strongholds, the Nationalists systematically tried to capture it, an area at a time. Huge artillery bombardments and heavy bombing pounded the Republican defences. Then they were attacked by charging Nationalists. The Republicans countered with a mixture of ambushes, guerrilla fighting, and defending the strategic heights of their mountains. The experience of the Mac Paps was pretty typical for the Republican defenders. Stationed in the Sierra de Pandores, or the Mountains of the Moon, it was a desolate area, scarred by war, covered with bodies, and reeking of death. One veteran recalled, quote, most of the area was bare rocks. Some hard jack pine and mountain scrub covered the crests, had been burned off by bombs and shells. The whole place was blackened, evil-looking, and stunk chokingly of death, since the dead could not be buried. The bodies were both Republican and Fascist dead, and we had to drag and carry them back to the firing position, where they lay stinking, wormy and fly-ridden piles, all the time we were there. It was impossible to dig in, and gun positions were prepared by painstakingly filling sandbags with rocks and chips. There was no water. The only route into our positions was a precarious mountain trail up the face of a cliff that dropped into a frightening ravine. All we did in the Pandores was endure and hold. End quote. The Canadians were on Hill 609, with the Washington Lincoln Brigade and the Cuban 24th Battalion on their flanks. The British were held in reserve after their bloodbath at the Pimple. For 2 weeks they reeled under the heaviest enemy mortar and artillery barrage of the war, combined with carpet bombing. In just 2 days the Condor Legion flew 40 missions and dropped 50 tons of bombs. In between bombardments, wave after wave of Nationalists surged towards their positions, with combat often going hand to hand.
Luchamos contra los moros, rumba la rumba la rumba la. Luchamos contra los moros, rumba la rumba la rumba la. Mercenarios y fascistas, ay Carmena, ay Carmena.
If there is a hell, it must look and feel like this. You lay flat on the barren, blackened mountain top as the shells relentlessly fall around you. Every explosion sends tremors through the ground that then shakes you to your very bones. Most of the battalion are dead or wounded. The remainder, like yourself, wait for the shelling and bombing to stop, because then the fascists will come. You think wishfully of your small town in Winnipeg that you left to fight in Spain. But as one of your comrades yells out, "They're coming," you shake away the daydreams. You have a job to do. It's legionnaires in their green uniforms, charging up the narrow mountain path as their bullets ricochet around you. As you return fire, you see your machine gunner slump forward with now lifeless eyes, red spreading across his chest. Grabbing the machine gun, you fire into the oncoming fascists, screaming out, "Here's some Canadian steel for you! No Pazaran!" By the end of August, when they were relieved, the MacPats had lost half their strength, and 2 company commanders were dead. It was the same all over the mountains of the moon, with similar casualty rates for both Nationalists and Republicans. As progress remained glacially slow for Franco's men, the Condor Legion and its dreaded Stuka dive bombers launched a wave of merciless attacks against the pontoon bridges, determined to cut off the defenders' supplies. Soon, Lister's men were short of everything from food to water to ammunition. The shortage of water was so bad that they had to urinate into the water jackets around the barrels of their Maxim machine guns to stop them from blowing up in their faces. Whilst their supplies were drying up, the never-ending bombardments were taking their toll on the Republicans. Soldiers hung pieces of wood from their necks to bite on during the shelling. Shell shock and battle fatigue cases skyrocketed. A communist officer compared the fighting to 2 rams butting their heads, waiting for one of them to break. The Republican defenders could but endure, flesh and blood resisting a hailstorm of steel. With such horrific casualties, both sides pulled out all the stops propaganda-wise to keep their men fighting. Franco had already styled the war as a crusade against Bolshevikism. Now the Ebro was portrayed as the Battle of Armageddon. Catholic priests and Muslim imams for the Moorish troops gave sermons that this was the final battle before God's victory on earth. On the Republican side, propaganda for the Spanish troops didn't focus on victory. Instead, it harked back to the cruel landlords, the brutal army, and the greedy church, of vengeance for generations of simmering hate and repression. For the international brigades, it portrayed the battle as a vital stepping stone in the war against fascism, a cry out against the fading light as the power of the fascist nations waxed and waned. For many, this was enough to endure for now, but for those with less zeal, there were other methods. Especially for prisoners of war fighting for the Nationalists, it was either advance or get shot. For the Republicans, Lister, Modesto, and especially that madman Marty, pledged to shoot anyone, quote, "who loses an inch of ground," end quote. General Modesto began to go a bit crazy around this time, resembling Hitler's increasingly bizarre orders as the Eastern Front collapsed. In one command he ranted, quote, "Not a single position must be lost. If the enemy takes one, there must be a rapid counterattack and as much fighting as necessary, but always making sure that it remains in Republican hands. Not a metre of ground to the enemy." End quote. It took months of repeated offensives and slaughter, but finally one of the rams began to break. In October, Franco launched a major attack on Hill 666. Quite appropriate, really. The key point of the Moon Mountains, towering over the valley below. The top of the hill was a lunar-like surface, with only bare rock for cover. The Republicans were determined to hold on to this key lookout, and the Nationalists kept it under continuous air and artillery bombardment. The Republicans clung on in desperate conditions for as long as they could, as the Nationalists committed themselves to attacking this barren spot, pouring in huge resources of shells, bombs, and men, with both sides suffering mounting losses. On the 2nd of October, the Nationalists took the heights of the nearby Sierra de la Val de Torre, At the close of the month, deploying 175 guns and 100 aircraft, they again attacked Hill 666. After a day of fighting, they took the high point, with the Republicans losing 500 dead and 1,000 prisoners. It was the beginning of the end, but early November, the mountains were fully in Nationalist hands as the battered and bruised Republicans fled back to the Ebro. After forcing their men to endure the unendurable and taking horrific casualties, the Republicans were left with only a small strip of territory on the right bank of the Ebro. At 4:30 in the morning of the 16th of November, taking advantage of a heavy river mist, the last men of the 35th Division recrossed the River Ebro by the iron bridge at Felix. 15 minutes later, it was blown up. An observer described it as, quote, a dry explosion. A flash of thundering from fragments of iron falling into the river announced the end of the Battle of the Ebro, 113 days after its beginning. End quote. The Ebro had been a harsh battlefield for a pitiless conflict, a summer counterpart to the winter horrors of Teruel. The Nationalists had sustained 60,000 casualties, the Republicans 75,000, of whom 30,000 died, many of them unburied in the Sierras which Modesto's army had been forced to abandon. Apart from the terrible loss of human life, almost all the weapons needed for the defence of Catalonia had been lost on this grotesque gamble. The fate of the Mac Paps really reveals just how devastating a battle this was. They entered it with over 600 men. When they recrossed the River Ebro, they had only 35 fit and able men. At least the communists admitted they were at fault and that the blame lay with them. No, of course they didn't. They blamed Trotskyite saboteurs. A commissar informed Moscow that the army of the Ebro had received no support from the Central Front because of, quote, sabotage and the malevolent action of General Miha and other commanders of the centre, Trotskyites to a man, end quote. Rojo was blamed for not ending the operation sooner, despite the fact that the whole point of it had been to hold on for as long as possible. The whole plan had been stupid from the beginning. They attacked an area Franco could easily reinforce, with a river to their backs, over which his air superiority could cut off their supplies. And now they had destroyed the People's Army. The Republic was truly on its knees awaiting the death blow. His key assumption had also turned out to be wrong. War didn't start in 1938. Chamberlain signed the Munich Agreement and famously declared, quote, peace for our time, end quote, while Hitler got the Sudetenland and would soon swallow the rest of Czechoslovakia up. The Republic stood alone. Even Stalin was now distancing himself from it. Worst of all, far from London and Paris paying attention to all the suffering on the Ebro, it had been completely overshadowed by the Munich Crisis. Really, it had all been for nothing. The defeat at the Ebro greatly weakened the communists, but like a cornered animal, they only got more vicious. Negrin had previously turned a blind eye to their activities, but now he enthusiastically joined in to save his power. He handed out death sentences to opponents. Even more disappeared into the prisons of the Sim secret police, while his whole regime became more authoritarian. When President Azana visited him to protest, Negrin sneered back, quote, the army is with me, end quote. Outside, the communists menacingly paraded their remaining military power. As the old revolutionary idealism disintegrated, it was appropriate, on the 21st of September 1938, Negrin announced the withdrawal of the international brigades to the League of Nations. His hope was that Mussolini and Hitler might follow suit, but that was not going to happen. Attempts were made to rekindle it at the moving farewell parades in Barcelona, now so battered they looked like, quote, the skeleton of a Hollywood make-believe town thrown on the scrap heap, end quote. The survivors of Madrid, Jarama, Guadalajara, Brunete, Belchite, Teruel, the Ebro, and other battles marched past to tumultuous cheers. Squadrons of planes thundered overhead, dipping their wings in a final salute. Under impassive portraits of Stalin, spectators wept. Hundreds of girls in native costume rushed forward, kissing the departing heroes and pressing huge bouquets of flowers into their arms. La Pasionaria made an emotional speech. Quote, "You can go proudly. You are history. You are legend. You are the heroic example of democracy's solidarity and universality. We shall not forget you. And when the olive tree of peace puts forth its leaves again, mingle with the laurels of the Spanish Republic's victory, come back." End quote. For some, the old faith remained. Before leaving Spain, Sam Wilde, commander of the British battalion, declared, quote, "The British battalion is prepared to carry on the work begun here, to see to it that our 500 comrades who sleep forever beneath Spanish soil shall serve as an example to the entire British people in the struggle against fascism." End quote. Others, however, could not move on from the madness of Marty, the endless accusations of being Trotskyites, the prisons and concentration camps, and the increasingly ludicrous propaganda. As one brigader bitterly complained, quote, "We deceived ourselves and were deceived by others." End quote. About half of them stayed and joined the regular Republican Army, mostly those from dictatorships where only the secret police waited for them at home. The end was not long in coming. Catalonia was now almost defenceless. What was left of its defenders were mostly without rifles. Of their 250 field guns, half were unserviceable, and few of their 40 tanks were in battle-worthy condition. On December the 23rd, a bright, clear, crisp day, Spanish and Italian troops poured into Catalonia, while in the skies above, the Condor Legion bombed and strafed anything that moved. The Nationalists made great progress, but it wasn't enough for the Condor Legion's commander, von Richthofen. He complained in his diary about the quality of their officers, quote, "Good troops and miserable generals, who are only battalion commanders, which is a natural consequence of the way things develop here. The Spaniards complain that they could relieve commanders, but they do not have better ones." End quote. A large part of the population of Barcelona, seized by fear, abandoned the city. So many documents were being burned around the city that many minor fires broke out. Shops were looted by people wanting food to take with them on the long, hard journey ahead. The coastal road eastward was jammed with buses, heavy lorries, vans, motorcars, and horse-drawn carts piled with mattresses and domestic utensils, trunks and suitcases, as well as exhausted women and children. Some men pushed their family belongings on handcarts, but it was hard to see how they'd have the strength to cross the Pyrenees. On the 26th of January, the Nationalists entered Barcelona in triumph and were taken off the leash. They were allowed several days of looting, their so-called war tax, in shops and apartment buildings, without worrying whether the owners were Reds or Whites. 10,000 people were executed in the first 5 days of the so-called liberation. The Catalan language was forbidden by law. Posters appeared everywhere proclaiming, "If you are Spanish, speak Spanish," and "Speak the language of the empire." One Francoist general darkly hinted that, quote, "It is a city which has sinned greatly, and now it must be cleansed. Altars should be erected in every street of the city, and masses said continually." End quote. Refugees from what was left of the Republican Army fled towards the French border. Defeat can bring out the worst and the best in people. The remaining brigaders who had been waiting for repatriation went back into the fight, heroically winning more time for the rest to flee. Communist officials, meanwhile, fired into the crowds of refugees blocking the roads so they could flee in their official cars. Some even commandeered ambulances at gunpoint, forcing the wounded to either walk or be left by the side of the road. Marty was particularly disgraceful. The mystified brigaders were ordered to assemble in a farmer's field in the middle of the night. As they milled around in the pitch black, Marty appeared, lit by the light of a single torch. His eyes were wide and unblinking, red-flecked, like he had finally gone completely mad. After a rambling, paranoid and incoherent speech where he blamed everyone but the communists and himself for the fall of Barcelona, he then committed an act that shook even his battle-hardened men. He shot an innocent peasant for the crime of turning on his bedroom light, claiming he was a Trotskyite trying to signal his location to the Condor Legion. Marty seemed determined to leave Spain the same way he'd lived there, shooting his own men. In particular, he wasted vital time trying to kill a group of German brigaders who had threatened to reveal his reign of terror when they got home. In a war filled with psychopaths, butchers and murderers, Marty was in a class of his own. His victims did get some comeuppance, however. He stayed in the Soviet Union during World War II and returned to France afterwards. He remained a powerful figure in the French Communist Party until his rivals slandered him as a police spy. It was obviously untrue, but it destroyed his career. A man who had spent his life condemning so many with false accusations fell prey to his own tricks. Altogether, 500,000 refugees fled across the French border towards an uncertain future. In a now famous scene, a French border guard prized open the fist of a refugee to make him drop the handful of Spanish earth which he had carried into exile. The Republican diaspora had begun. President Azana wanted to resign, but was persuaded to wait for now and take refuge in the Spanish embassy in Paris. Negrin was the only high-up official to head back to Spain after escaping Catalonia. Now, only the southern Republican zone remained, centred around Madrid and Valencia. This had once been the Communist main power base, but after the May Days in 1937, it had shifted north to Barcelona and Catalonia. But now they were occupied, and the Communists' best troops had been bled to death on the Ebro. They were suddenly very vulnerable. The Communists tried to bring back the popular enthusiasm and resistance that had stopped Franco in the Battle of Madrid back in 1936. La Pasionaria announced at a rally their new slogan of, quote, "Spain will be the torch which will light the road of liberation for people subjugated by fascism," end quote. Rather more clunky than her famous No Pasaran, or They Shall Not Pass, unsurprisingly, it was a bit of a damp squib and didn't catch on. After over 2 years of civil war, the people were tired, apathetic, and just wanted the war over. Despite calling for resistance to the bitter end, Negrin rather undermined his own credibility with his own conduct. Taking up residence in a luxurious villa near the port of Alicante, he gorged himself on expensive food and wine, while new women were brought to him every few days. Not a bad life, I guess, but it did not endear him to his weary people. Surrounded by 300 communist commando bodyguards, he became increasingly isolated and erratic. Instructions and telegrams poured out from his villa, ordering total resistance one minute, and the next, preparing for evacuation. Being surrounded by communists seemed to infect him with paranoia as he lashed out at Trotskyite saboteurs and threatened to shoot anyone who disagreed with him. One more final political crisis was about to engulf the Republic. The communists began to plot to fully take over the remaining Republican zone, committed to carrying on the war and purging their enemies. Meanwhile, more moderate army commanders, like the hero of Madrid, General Mija, began organising to overthrow Negrin and break the shackles of communist rule, hoping to get a compromise peace with Franco. At this stage of the war, it was like two bald men fighting over a comb, but at least the communists would finally get a taste of their own medicine. In March 1939, the crisis finally reached boiling point due to 3 events. First, Britain and France recognised Franco's government. No help was coming from Paris or London. Rumours then began to swirl that the communists were planning to use their control of Republican shipping to ensure that their members got away, while those belonging to other parties and organisations would be left to face the nationalist revenge on their own. When Negrin made a rare visit to the front, an anarchist general confronted him, icily condemning, quote, Those who talk so much of resistance while they collect valuables and goods to sell abroad and get their own families out of Spain. End quote. As a final straw to break the camel's back, Negrin put the communists fully in charge of the army. Their opponents were now terrified they were about to be purged. In Madrid, Colonel Casado led all the other factions in a coup against Negrin. Communist troops flooded into the city and heavy street fighting erupted as the two sides battled for control. Loudspeakers played endless revolutionary tunes, screeching about resisting the Trotskyite fascist junta. But the citizens of Madrid had long ago tuned out. Most cared little about who prevailed. 2,000 died in the fighting, but the communists were defeated, and the remnants of their force surrendered. It hadn't helped that most of their leaders and commissars were bugging out of the country, while their men fought and died in Madrid. Communist power was finally broken, but it was all too late. Casado tried to negotiate with Franco, but the caudillo would not be deprived of his triumph. He demanded unconditional surrender. Unable to coax any concessions out of the Nationalists, he finally ordered an end to resistance. The Republican fronts collapsed. Surrounded Republican troops were ordered to pile arms before they were marched off to bull rings or open-air camps. Others who escaped capture threw away their weapons and set off for home on foot. The last entry in the official Condor Legion war diary summed up the collapse. Quote, "In the course of the day, radio stations and transmitters in all provincial towns offered their submission and expressed their devotion to nationalist Spain and its caudillo. The war can be said to be at an end." End quote. On the 19th of May, 1939, Franco held a grand victory parade in Madrid. For years you have waited for this. Years of hiding from the Reds and the secret police, enduring the food shortages, all for this moment. The Nationalists have won, and now is a time to celebrate. A huge triumphal arch has been erected, emblazoned with massive letters proclaiming victory and Franco. The man himself, the chosen saviour of Spain, stands on a large tribune as endless ranks of soldiers march past. He wears the uniform of a captain general, but you can see the dark blue collar of a Falangist shirt underneath, and on his head the red beret of the Carlists. Below him, in front of the stand, his personal bodyguard of Moroccan cavalry with gleaming swords. The famous Moors who did so much to smash the godless Republic. As the Falangists marched by, they raised their hands in a fascist salute to the caudillo. So many colours: the dark blue of the Falangists, the green of the Foreign Legion, the desert uniforms of the Moroccans, and the red caps and rosaries of the Carlists. Then comes the Germans of the legendary Condor Legion, led by Colonel von Richthofen himself. The crowd goes wild. Then, in the sky above, planes shoot over, forming the initials of Viva Franco. Viva Franco indeed. Franco became dictator of all of Spain, but ruled a devastated country. There had been massive destruction of the country's infrastructure: railways, roads, bridges, ports, power lines and telephone systems. Some 60% of rolling stock had been lost, and 40% of the merchant fleet. 250,000 buildings had been destroyed, and a similar number severely damaged. The economy was on life support. Things only got worse when Franco embarked on his disastrous attempt to make Spain self-sufficient. Meanwhile, the Nationalists still had to deal with guerrilla fighting in some areas of Spain until 1965. While with the outbreak of World War II, Hitler expected Franco to join the Axis. It wasn't a great inheritance, and few thought Franco would survive the fall of Nazi Germany. The Caudillo, with his small stature, squeaky voice, and obsession with conspiracy theories about the Freemasons, was always easy to underestimate. However, he was a good politician. He outmaneuvered his rivals, kept the various factions in line, and was able to stay out of the war. He focused instead on domestic repression. His press officer, Captain Gazzalio, summed up the mood of the new regime, describing the Spanish peasantry as, quote, slave stock. Only when they are used as slaves are they happy. End quote. The last prisoners of war weren't released until the 50s, and they were used as slave labour. They helped build the most controversial monument in Spain, the Valley of the Fallen. Built in the neoclassical fascist style to honour those who died in the Civil War, it remains a fraught subject in modern Spain. Franco's regime would last until 1976, and the dictator would die in his bed. He allied with America in the Cold War and brought a measure of prosperity to Spain thanks to reforms in the 1960s. With his death, Spain slowly returned to democracy. Those exiles that were still alive were able to return. No one was held accountable for the repression of the Francoist era. Spain embraced the informal pact of forgetting and tried to put the Civil War behind it. Yet as much as Spain wanted to forget, the Civil War and its legacy still haunted the landscape. That's because the two Spains still exist, just in different forms. The battle for power between the centre and Madrid and its always rebellious provinces of Catalonia and the Basque Country still continues, while the role of the Catholic Church in Spain's identity is still a big issue. Even the memory of Franco is far from clear-cut. While few would say he was a completely positive figure now, many see him as a strong man who brought prosperity in the 60s. Obviously, there are just as many who see him as a murderous tyrant. Since 2018 and the rise of the Vox Party, fascism is once again having a growth spurt in Spain, idealising both Franco and the old Falangist leader, José Primo de Rivera. The triumph of Franco still haunts Spain, even though it has changed so much. Thank you for listening. To help the podcast grow, please like, leave a review, or tell a friend. There's still some bonus episodes I would like to do on the Spanish Civil War, but after this truly epic series, I need a break. Instead, we're going to cover some other wars, and then later in the year, I'll release the bonus episodes. In the next episode, we'll cover one of America's craziest military expeditions. I can only describe it as an X-rated version of Avatar. Join me for a tale of cannibal warriors, mutinying sailors, and nubile island women in the Nuku Hiva campaign. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.